learn more about guarding my privacy for next life when I might have some. I just watched President Trump's, oh yeah, it's February 11th, 2019. Just watched President Trump's rally in El Paso. And now, I don't think I made any good videos the last 2 days. Certainly no haiku. Something happened. Something happened. Happened? Happened. Okay. Disclaimer that I'm not a therapist. This could be a trigger. Watch at your own risk. And technically, as far as I know, I still have permission to share this material online with my experience of being a consumer of this material, which is mental health material. It's always important to try and get professional mental health therapy if you need it. I've had it. Yes. And life is much better from it. So, DBT is dialectical behavior therapy, and there's 3 modules. One of the modules is emotion regulation, and emotions are biological mechanisms that induce us to action. So we're taking action. Dang it, this is really irritating me. I've got so much stuff piled up on my table. Please don't crash. And if you crash, don't break. There, that's better. Because otherwise I was just like some kind of freaky floating head without even being memed into a freaky floating head. It's just my regular freaky self. Okay. Emotion regulation. Rational comebacks, antidotes to distortions. So I just read the 15 cognitive distortions, the way that your mind can twist around and screw your thinking up. And these are the rational comebacks, which are like the antidotes to the distortions that we can create for ourselves. The reality distortions. Distortions of reality. Even without doing any kind of like, anything. Alright. Already did a trigger warning. Listed below are rational correlatives, or correlatives. I don't know how to say that word. They go with them. To the 15 distorted thinking styles. It isn't necessary to read through the list from beginning to end. Instead, use it as a reference when you are having problems with a particular distortion. The key comeback statements for each distortion are listed on the right in boldface. Well, I don't think it's a good idea to cook something without the standard way of cooking is you go, you find your recipe, and you read the whole recipe so you know exactly how it goes before you even get your ingredients together. You read the whole recipe. Then you go back to the ingredient section and you get the list of ingredients. So, yeah, it's kind of a stupid entry to say like, oh, we're going to start by telling you not to even read the instructions. That's just like dumb. That must be a typo. No offense to whichever book this came from. It's a really super old book. That's why. So, the first distortion is filtering. And the rational comeback is shift your focus. No need to magnify. So you've been stuck in a mental groove, focusing on things from your environment that typically tend to frighten, sadden, or anger you. To conquer filtering, filtering in a negative way is when a person like filters out all the good aspects of something, focuses in on the stuff that's like scary for them or somehow negative in some way. So, and you can filter in other ways too, and filter just like feed yourself a big line of BS about stuff too. I mean, we all can do that. To conquer filtering, you will have to deliberately shift focus. You can shift focus in two ways. First, place your attention on coping strategies to deal with the problem, rather than obsessing about the problem itself. Second, categorize your primary mental theme as loss, injustice, or fill in your own theme here. And if your theme is loss, focus instead on what you do have that is of value. If your theme is danger, focus on things in your environment that represent comfort and safety. If your theme is injustice, including stupidity, incompetence, etc., shift your attention to what people do that does meet with your approval. When you're filtering, you usually end up magnifying your problems. To combat magnifying, stop using words like terrible, awful, disgusting, horrendous, etc. In particular, banish the phrase, I can't stand it. You can stand it because history shows that human beings can survive almost any psychological blow and can endure incredible physical pain. You can get used to and cope with almost anything. Try saying to yourself phrases such as, no need to magnify and I can cope. You can endure. It might warp you, but you can endure. Polarized thinking, no black and white judgments. That's the comeback. So no black and white judgments, think in percentages. The key to overcoming polarized thinking is to stop making black or white judgments. People are not either happy or sad, loving or rejecting, brave or cowardly, smart or stupid. They fall somewhere along a continuum. They are a little bit of each. Human beings are just too complex to be reduced to dichotomous judgments. If you have to make these kinds of ratings, think in terms of percentages. About 30% of me is scared to death, and 70% is holding on and coping. About 60% of the time, he seems terribly preoccupied with himself. But there's the 40% when he can be really generous. 5% of the time, I'm an ignoramus. The rest of the time, I do all right. It seems like a good, smart way of doing it. The third distortion is overgeneralization, and the rational comeback is quantity. And do you have evidence for conclusions? And there are no absolutes. Overgeneralization is simply the tendency to exaggerate, the propensity to take a I get it. So overgeneralization is simply the tendency to exaggerate. It's the propensity to take a button and sew a vest onto it. So instead of taking your vest and sewing your button onto the vest, you take your little button and you sew a whole vest onto it. I don't know. That's kind of like a hard thing to be imagining. You can fight this tendency by quantifying instead of using words like huge, awful, massive, minuscule, etc. Moreover, you can examine how much evidence you really have for your conclusion. If the conclusion is based on one or two cases, a single mistake or one small symptom, then throw it out until you have more convincing proof. By convincing, I would say until you have a higher quantity of proof. Use this variant of the 3-column technique. So you have 3 columns. One would be evidence for my conclusion, evidence against the conclusion, and the alternative conclusion. So if you overgeneralize, you think in absolutes. You should therefore avoid statements and assumptions that require the use of words such as every, all, always, none, never, everybody, and nobody. Thoughts and statements that include these words ignore the exceptions and shades of gray. To become more flexible, use instead words such as may, sometimes, and often. Be particularly sensitive to absolute predictions about the future, such as, no one will ever love me. They are extremely dangerous because they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. It's true. You can make other types of tapes to play in your mind. The fourth kind of mental distortion, cognitive distortion, is called mind reading. And the antidote to it says, check it out, and evidence for conclusions, which I think is going to be like, maybe you should do a little fact checking. That would be my guess. That's even more better. Table's just a pile. Mind reading is the tendency to make inferences about how people feel and think. In the long run, you're probably better off making no inferences. An inference is, of course, like you're just like assuming how someone is feeling or thinking instead of checking with them. So it's better off not to assume about people at all. So either believe what they tell you or hold no belief at all until some conclusive evidence comes your way. Treat all of your notions about people as hypotheses to be tested and checked out by asking them. If you lack direct information from the person involved, but have other evidence, evaluate your conclusion using the 3-column technique. So evidence for the conclusion, evidence against the conclusion, or alternative conclusion. So number 5, the 5th cognitive distortion is called catastrophizing. And the antidote to that is realistic odds. Think about the realistic odds of it happening, probably. So catastrophizing is the royal road to anxiety. Woo! It's not the low road to it, it's the high road. As soon as you catch yourself, make an honest assessment of the situation in terms of odds or percent of probability. Are the chances 1 in 100,000, like 0.001%, 1 in 1,000, which is 0.1%, 1 in 20, which is 5%? Looking at odds, you realistically evaluate whatever is frightening you. The 6th is personalization, and the antidote is, again, check it out. Do you have evidence for conclusions? And why risk comparisons? If your tendency is to personalize, force yourself to prove that the boss's frown has to do with you. Check it out. If you can't ask the question, use the 3-column technique shown above to test your conclusions. Make no conclusions unless you are satisfied that you have reasonable evidence and proof. It is also important to abandon the habit of comparing yourself negatively or positively with other people. Comparisons are an exciting form of gambling. Sometimes they're a useful, I think, way of learning stuff too. Just depends. Sometimes you win and really outshine someone else. But when you lose, you set yourself up for a blow to your self-esteem and maybe the beginning of a long, deep depression. Your worth doesn't depend on being better than others, so why start the comparison gamble? Well, I think that since this book was written, so it's like 1980s, so 30 some odd years ago, 40 years ago, really? Pretty close. So nowadays, we might even, we're like wise enough to look at it as like you don't have to like, outshining somebody isn't necessarily a win. And if they outshine you, it's not necessarily your loss. It could be. It definitely could be. It depends on the situation, though. So that's another way is to look at it. I would think situationally. Like 7, control fallacies, external and omnipotence. So the antidote is, I make it happen. Each one is responsible. Aside from natural disasters, rather than being extremely controlled, you are responsible for what happens in your world. Sometimes. You make it happen. If you are unhappy, there are specific choices you have made and continue to make, but have the byproduct of unhappiness. Sometimes, I mean, most of the time. You usually achieve in life whatever your top priority is. For example, if security is more important than anything else, you may have it at the expense of passion and excitement. You may long for excitement, but security was the higher priority. Ask yourself, what choices have I made that resulted in this situation? What decisions can I make now to change it? The omnipotence fallacy is the opposite side of the coin from the external control fallacy. Instead of everyone else's problems, if someone is in pain, it's your responsibility to do something about it. The fault is with you. If you don't take up the burdens of others, the key to overcoming the omnipotence fallacy is to recognize that each one is responsible for himself. We're all captains of our own ships, making the decisions that steer our lives. If someone is in pain, he or she has the ultimate responsibility to overcome or accept it. There is a difference between generosity and the slavish adherence to a conviction that you have to help everybody. And remember, part of respecting others includes letting them live their own lives, suffer their own pains, and solve their own problems. To some degree. I mean, to the most part and most degree. And I'm glad to be free of feeling responsible for everybody, but we are also responsible for each other to some degree, or else we're not living in a society. 8, the fallacy of fairness. And the antidote is preference versus fairness. Outside of a court of law, the concept of fairness is too dangerous to use. The word fair is a nice disguise for personal preferences and wants. What you want is fair. What the other person wants is bogus. Be honest with yourself and the other person. Say what you want or prefer without dressing it up in the fallacy of fairness. Yeah, probably, unless you're really figuring out a way to be equally fair. 9, blaming. And the antidote is, I make it happen. Each one is responsible. So it's your responsibility to assert your needs. Say no or go elsewhere. The other person is not responsible for knowing or helping you meet your needs. No one else can really be at fault if you, a responsible adult, are distressed or unhappy. Focus on the choices you have made that created this situation. Examine what options you have now for coping with it, which actually are a lot more, huh? There is a difference between taking responsibility and turning the blame on yourself. Taking responsibility means accepting the consequences of your own choices. Blaming yourself means attacking your own self-esteem and labeling yourself bad if you make a mistake. Taking responsibility doesn't imply that you are also responsible for what happens to others. Blaming yourself for another person's problems is a form of self-aggrandizement. It means you think you are having more impact on your lives than they are. Oh, it means you think you are having more impact on their lives than they are. Yeah, and it's like sort of can be a form of abuse because then you're just like, yeah, it's a little bit sucky. It's definitely controlling. Shoulds. That's the number 10. Flexible rules is the antidote and flexible values. Re-examine and question any personal rules or expectations that include the words should, ought, or must. Flexible rules and expectations don't use these words because there are always exceptions in special circumstances. Think of at least 3 exceptions to your rule, and then imagine all the exceptions there must be that you can't think of. You may get irritated when people don't act according to your personal values, but your personal values are just that, personal. They may work for you, but as missionaries have discovered all over the world, they don't always work for others. People aren't all the same. The key is to focus on each person's uniqueness, his or her particular needs, limitations, fears, and pleasures, because it's impossible to know all of these complex interrelations, even with intimates. You can't be certain whether your values apply to another. You are entitled to your opinion, but allow for the possibility of being wrong. Also allow for other people to find different things important. Number 11 is emotional reasoning, and the antidote is feelings can lie. What you feel is entirely dependent on what you think. That's not true, because your emotions will get distorted if you're eating wrong. That's the truth. If you have distorted thoughts, your feelings won't have validity. Your feelings can lie to you. That's true. In fact, if you're feeling depressed or anxious all the time, it's almost certain they are lying to you. There's nothing sacred or automatically true about what you feel. If you feel unattractive or feel foolish or embarrassed, you tend to believe yourself ugly or a fool. But stop a minute. Maybe it isn't true, and you are suffering for nothing. Be skeptical about your feelings and examine them as you would a used car. 12. Fallacy of change. And the way to antidote it is you make it happen. When you try to push people to change, you are asking them to be different so you can be happy. The assumption is that your happiness is in some way dependent on them and how they behave. Your happiness depends on you, on each decision you make. You have to decide whether to leave or stay, work as a baker or an electrician, say yes or no. Each person makes it happen for himself or herself. It's dangerous to ask someone else to make it happen for you because people resist when they are pressured to change. If they do change, they often resent the person who expected them to do so. Expected them. But you could anticipate someone to change, maybe, because you want someone to have some kind of expectation of you. 13. Global labeling. The antidote is be specific. Global labels are usually false because they focus on only a single characteristic or behavior but imply that it's the whole picture. Rather than applying global labels, you can limit your observations to a specific case. Ask yourself if a case is always true or only true now or only true some of the time. And 14, which doesn't cover all 15. Oh, no, there's 15. So being right. The antidote is active listening. If you've always got to be right, you don't listen because you can't afford to. And I'm just going to say that it's possible to be physically addicted to the feeling of being right because you get a hit of dopamine in your brain every time your brain thinks that you're right. You don't actually have to be right, you just have to think that you're right. So anyway, you can't afford to listen if you're obsessed with being right. Because listening might lead you to conclude that you are wrong sometimes. The key to overcoming being right is active listening. As an active listener, you participate in communication by repeating what you think you've heard in order to make sure you really understand what was said to you. And that can be done in a super annoying way too, so be careful of that. It can be really useful, it can be really patronizing, in my experience. This checking out process helps two people who disagree to appreciate each other's point of view. A proportionately greater amount of time is spent trying to understand the other person than in devising your own rebuttals and attacks. Remember that other people believe what they are saying as strongly as you believe in your convictions, and that there is not always one right answer. Focus on what you can learn from the other person's opinion. So yeah. They should do a second edition. Maybe there is a second edition, or it's been edited a little bit more. 15, the last one is the heavens reward fallacy. And the antidote is the reward is now. This distorted thinking style accepts pain and unhappiness because those who do good are rewarded in the end. But if doing good means you're doing things that you don't want to do and sacrificing things you resent giving up, then you are likely to reap no reward at all. You'll become so bitter and unhappy that people will steer clear of you. In reality, the reward is now. Your relationships, your progress towards your goals, and the care you give people you love should be intrinsically rewarding. Most days, your emotional bank balance should be in the black. If you're drained, running in the red ink for days or weeks at a time, something is wrong. You need to arrange your activities to provide some here and now reward, dropping or sharing the activities that chronically drain you. Heaven is a long way off and you can get very tired. It's part of your responsibility to those that you care about not to do things that will lead you to feel resentful. Remember that you wouldn't want others doing things for you that they didn't want to. Yep. All right. That is that.